Hope had been nervous for weeks. She was sure with all her heart that she wanted to be with Michel for the rest of her years. He was her soulmate, her lover, her best friend, and her world. He was also her confidant in everything but one thing. But this evening, everything was going to change. She wouldn't talk to anyone about what she'd kept from Michel, not even her mother, with whom she'd shared everything, not even the girlfriends she'd grown up with and first talked about boys and dreams. The only caveat was more of a formality. She sent the question to a well-known couples therapist who had a column on relationships in the local newspaper. The advice she received in response after it was finally published seemed cautiously optimistic, though fraught. Hope had read and reread the response many times, and as their wedding approached, she decided it was now or never. Michel would understand, and it would prove their love for each other, strengthen their bond, and help bind them in partnership for the rest of their lives. She pulled herself together and confirmed in her mind and heart that tonight would be just that. It had to be just that. She didn't spare a single detail. Everything had to be perfect. Hope had met the tall, athletically built, and devilishly handsome Michel when she was only 18. He was older at 21 and a friend of her cousin. She was instantly drawn to him, and suddenly the trite concept of love at first sight no longer seemed so trite. It was she who chased after him, though the chase didn't last long. Hope was beautiful, alluring, and had a wonderful personality. Michel didn't stand a chance, and truth be told, he didn't want to. 6 years later, he proposed to her, and to his great joy, she accepted, sealing the promise forever. Hope was happier than she had ever been in her life. They discussed where they would live, what they would do, and when they would have children. It was as if they were virtually building their future, dreaming of lasting love, friendship, and fidelity. Hope's life was perfect if it weren't for one thing. One little issue that kept her on her toes. A caveat that was to be discussed tonight. It had to be perfect. Michel Corbin worked at the local middle school as a physical education and English teacher and had recently been promoted to assistant 8th grade principal. His star was rising, and he planned to eventually become a school principal himself. The love of a beautiful woman who agreed to be his wife was the icing on the cake in his beautiful world. Lately, however, his mind had become clouded, even as his heart was full of love for his soulmate. Hope had been in a strange mood lately, and while he wasn't too worried about her or them, he wanted to do something special for the woman he loved. He'd planned a romantic getaway for the coming weekend, and now that the reservation was confirmed at a lovely little hotel in Hunter Valley, he was thrilled. He could barely hide the excitement that gripped him. He was going to surprise her this evening and hopefully have a wonderful lovemaking session afterward. After a nearly hour drive home from work, he climbed the stairs to their rented apartment. He had a dozen red roses and a bottle of Hope's favorite champagne, Moet and Chandon Brut Imperial. It was usually chosen for special occasions, but Michel felt tonight was special. He wanted it to be special. He wanted it to amaze her, surprise her, and dispel any doubts, and problems she might have had. He knew that she loved him as much as he loved her, and this evening was only meant to be a confirmation of that love as they looked forward to starting their life together. Upon entering the apartment, however, he was surprised. Hope had placed many candles around the apartment, and when they were lit and the lights dimmed, the apartment had a beautiful and elegant, yet strangely ethereal atmosphere. The small glass dining table was set for a romantic dinner, and in the center of it stood proudly the beautiful pewter candlesticks given by Aunt Gemma. Divine smells wafted from the kitchen. He smiled. Hope was clearly making an effort, which meant one of two things. She wanted something, or wanted him. Even her wanting something usually ended up being the latter. "Hi, honey," she said as he walked in. He knelt silently, holding out the gifts he'd bought her to his lady. Hope groaned with delight and genuine affection as she accepted the flowers and champagne, both of which were her favorites, and her heart fluttered at the fact that he could be such a debauchee and such a romantic. "Dinner will be ready soon. Go and tidy up." He was in a great mood as he dressed in the loose pants and black monogrammed polo she had recently bought him. Dinner, as usual, was excellent. Hope was a wonderful cook and had once nurtured plans to become a chef. But the hotel business was a lonely business, and her friend's older sister had talked her out of it, saying that working in the kitchen was a terrible career choice, incompatible with a strong relationship. So those dreams were dispelled, and instead, she put all her passion for food into making her loved ones satisfied and happy. As they sat admiring each other over a glass of champagne, Michel began to think about what was to come. He appraised Hope with hungry eyes. But first, he wanted to inform her of his plans. Hope, he said with joyful purposefulness and a wide smile, his heart aching for her, his body craving her. But she raised her hand to silence him, and as he looked into her eyes, the smile slowly disappeared from his face. Michel, there's something I need to say, and if I don't say it now... She suddenly looked into his eyes, concerned and nervous. She absent-mindedly waved her hands and crunched her knuckles. Michel, I love you so much. I love you with all my heart, and you make me so happy. She still looked nervous, and now those nerves were beginning to infect Michel. Her words, her actions, everything spoke volumes. Hope, is there... She silenced him again. Michel, you're the best man I've ever known. Oh, how do I say this? I've already planned everything, but it's all falling apart. He said the last sentence in a whisper, lowering his eyes. Michel, I've thought about this a lot. I even sent... She almost stuttered from the nerves that were building up inside her, threatening to burst out at any moment with a flood of tears. I sent the question to... She paused. It was harder than she thought, harder than anything else she had ever done. She realized she had to write a script. Maybe you could read it? She said it hurriedly and furiously, the words piling on top of each other. Maybe you could read what I sent? And the reply. While Michel sat confused, Hope jumped up from her seat like a bundle of frantic energy. Grabbing her phone, she muttered to herself and quickly opened the bookmarked page to a column by Ishta Madison, a relationship therapist. Here, she said quietly, unsure of herself. Still, she placed the phone in Michael's hand, whose face clearly read confusion and doubt. Please read this with an open heart and an open mind. I love you so much. He slowly lowered his gaze to Hope's phone. It was a well-known couples advice column for a local online newspaper. He'd been reading it often for the past year. But now Michel looked up and raised an eyebrow in Hope's direction. She clumsily poured herself a large glass of champagne, then threw her head back and gulped it down in one gulp. He lowered his gaze to his phone again and began to read, his heart breaking as he did so. I am deeply in love with the man I've been dating for the past 6 years, since I turned 18. He is everything to me, and I want to live the rest of my life with him, and I know he feels the same way. I love him so much it hurts, but I have one issue that keeps me up at night and has me thinking about our fast-approaching wedding. My finances are the only man I have ever been in a relationship with. He is 4 years older than me, and I feel like I am missing out on the opportunity to get to know other people. I want to know what it's like to be with someone else. It's a burning desire that I'm struggling to overcome. I want us to have a period of 6 months before we get married, so we can both be free to see and have fun with other people. How can I ask him, convince him, without ruining what we have? Out of surprise, Michel dropped the phone and it clattered loudly against the glass top of the table. It was a death blow to what he thought was so beautiful, so pure. Now it was tainted by dark deceit and illicit lust. Her reasons seemed unfathomable, impossible, and illogical. Do you have someone already? He finally managed to break out. His voice was quiet, but the pain was palpable. Michel, no, oh no, oh no, 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 I could never cheat on you. Not for anything in the world. She reached out to take his hand. She took it and gently stroked the back of it. You are my man in every way, she continued, but was shocked when he abruptly pulled his hand from hers. But I am not and will not be. This He pointed to his phone with a wave of his hand. Changes everything. It tells me I'm not your everything. Why? Don't I love you enough? He pleaded, his voice harsh, his eyes searching. This was the moment. She knew these questions would be asked. Such a simple request, such a harsh answer. With trembling hands, she clumsily poured another glass of wine and swallowed hard. No, Michelle. No. I know you love me. I see it every day. I feel it every moment. Your love for me is so beautiful, so sweet and tender. But that's not the point. It's because I have so many questions about myself, about what I am or what I'm missing. I have so little experience. We met when I was only 18. I was still very young. Now I'm a woman, but I've only had one real relationship, and it's a great relationship. But I'm nervous. I'm anxious. When I see my girlfriends with their boyfriends, feelings boil up in me, and I wonder how it's going to be. Oh, please don't, she said, seeing the tears on his face. Please don't cry. Oh God, I've ruined everything. I'm ruining everything. He nodded silently, watching the woman he loved tell him over and over again that he wasn't enough for her, even though she was trying to tell him otherwise. Her words outweighed her intent. But it's for both of us, she continued, trying to help him break through the darkness, to see her light and understand her compassion and devotion to him. You may see other people too, but it will be the two of us, confirming our relationship, our future marriage, our life together forever. She rose from her seat and walked over to him, gently and timidly putting her arms around his neck. Would you please read the article in full and then discuss it with me? Please, she pleaded. This is such a serious moment in our lives, more so than ever before, and I need to know that you wouldn't mind discussing it with me. Be open to my love for you, but also open to the possibilities. In a sort of haze, he gingerly reached for her phone again, but he was clearly alarmed and almost frightened by it. It was as if the phone was a snake ready to strike. He knew her access code, so he unlocked the phone to take another look at that insidious, terrifying article. But even in that moment, he thought that since he knew her code, maybe that was all he knew about her. Until this evening, he had felt like he knew everything. He felt small and alone in a world of new and terrible emotions. Still, Michel forced himself to read the article, though he remained reserved. At least it seemed that Ishta Madison was trying to be as objective as possible, not advising her to actively indulge in these fantasies, these desires, but to exercise caution. He flipped through some of her comments again and again, reading and rereading what seemed to be nails driven into the lid of the coffin in which his hopes and dreams lay. She wrote her response cautiously but optimistically. Attempting to change an existing monogamous relationship to an open relationship is risky and can have unforeseen and detrimental consequences. An open relationship can lead to many negative consequences for both people. Resentment, jealousy, and feelings of betrayal can and do arise. Discuss the needs of both people on an ongoing basis. Define a firm and foundational set of rules that you both agree to strictly follow. Rules and communication are the foundation and groundwork that is necessary for an open relationship to not only survive, but to thrive. Along with the rules you will set for meeting other people, you need to confirm what will happen to your current relationship. Will you continue to date during this time, make dates to be with other people, or will you put your current relationship on hold until you are done with others? Will you support each other during this period of time and research, and if so, how? Keep in mind that even voicing your desire can affect your relationship. Take some time to make sure it's really what you want before you discuss it. Remember that the grass is not always greener. The grass isn't always greener. He repeated the phrase and looked at Hope. There was hope in her eyes, as her name implied, but moisture glistened in the corners. She knew he was hurting, knew he was struggling. But in that moment, he didn't think she knew how much. The words about how even the expression of desire affects a relationship resonated with him, and he knew it was true because he had strongly doubted the love she was confessing to him. This was the first time in their relationship that he had questioned her love and devotion to him. He could hardly imagine how they would get to their wedding in 7 months. "And you want that?" he finally asked in a somber voice. It seemed to him that she was dying, and he must make her repent of her sins, confess and bare her soul. She nodded. "Do you want this at our wedding?" "No," she almost shouted. "Not over our wedding, never over our wedding. I want to be your wife and grow old with you. I want to be the mother of your children and watch our grandchildren with you in their arms. I want to be with you until the day I die." "But," he added, letting the silence linger, waiting for her to respond with what he knew she would respond with, what he knew she should respond with. "But I want to experience things. People. The life that exists outside of us. I don't want to put that above our wedding, just sooner. I need some time. Oh, Michelle, I love you so much. I need you so much. Please take me, Michelle. Please show me that you love me the way I love you, the way I need you. I can't, Hope. I can't be with you. Not like this, not with this, not with this thing hanging over me. I need to think this through. I need time. This feels like an ambush. I, 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 he stammered. I need to leave." He pushed her hands away, then stood up, grabbed his keys and phone, and headed for the door. She could barely breathe, shocked at the way her love was slipping away from her. But then he stopped at the door, turning his back to her, and opened it, giving her a fleeting moment of faith that everything was going to be okay. Michelle turned slightly and looked at Hope, still lying on the ground watching the horror unfold. "I'm not leaving for good. I just need time to think. You just dropped all this on me, ambushed me, and I can't respond now. I've got a lot to think about. I need to make sense of it all. Of you, of me, of us. I'll be back tomorrow, hopefully." "I love you, Hope," he whispered with intense emotion. And then he was gone, and the door closed before she could recover. "I love you too, Michelle," she sighed as she watched the man she loved disappear. Finally, holding back tears, she grabbed her phone and called her friend Trisha. "I need you, Trisha. I need the band. I've ruined everything." Her voice was filled with pain, confusion, and desperate, pathetic need. "Michelle's gone." There was such desperation in her voice, so close to hysteria, that Trisha, overcome with momentary indecision, agreed. It was a work night, which complicated the situation and initially gave her something to think about, but Hope was hurting, and she clearly needed them all. If Michelle was gone, if Hope had done something so egregious that the man who loved her so much they all jokingly claimed it was disgusting was gone, then she had no choice but to come to her rescue. So Trisha started making more calls. She called everyone and convinced Eliza, Petra, Lila, and Kimberly that Hope needed help, and yes, they would all come together for their friend. It took about an hour before everyone gathered, but for the sake of their friend in need, they showed up. Everyone was shocked at Hope's haggard and pathetic appearance. They hugged her, cried for her without even knowing her story. She was their friend, and they had all found themselves by her side more than once, and now they had come for her. Finally, Eliza interrupted the awkwardness and brought up the question they all needed an answer to. Everyone was afraid that Hope had cheated on Michelle. What else could have made him leave? His devotion to her was something out of sapphic romance novels and Hollywood fantasies and the envy of everyone else. Hope simply showed them the article, as she had done with Michelle earlier in the evening. "I sent this, and tonight I finally broached the subject with him." "And you didn't?" Petra, the youngest of the group, who was only 19, asked. "You wouldn't do that to him, surely?" Hope just nodded, eliciting a sigh from the others. At least she wasn't cheating, but from what the article said, from what they realized from her appearance, from the tension in her voice, and from the way she clenched her hands, it was clear she was looking for approval to do just that. "This man loves you, Hope. He adores you." Trisha was thrilled. She had dreamed of finding a man like Michelle, but an endless string of disappointments awaited her. One loser after another had simply passed through her dating life, and while she'd never been jealous of her friend's relationship, she'd certainly longed for what Hope had, spending many nights longing for even a fraction of the happiness Hope enjoyed. "So we'll just call it off," Eliza said. "Not the wedding," she added hastily, as everyone looked at her anxiously. "I mean, just say you've changed your mind. Don't do it." "But I want to. I need to," Hope repeated her earlier argument. "I won't cheat on him, and I can't explain it in a way that sounds logical even to me. But he's the only man I've ever been with. I need something else. I need to explore and understand. Oh, I blew it. He wouldn't even make love to me when I begged him. He had never turned me down before, but tonight I was trying to force him to be with me. But the thought of being with me drove him away. He pushed me away and just walked away." "Can you blame him?" replied Petra, as the group hugged once more and burst into tears. "He probably thought you were trying to bribe him." "But—" Hope tried to speak but fell silent. That's exactly what she did. Michelle saw right through her, right through her. "Don't confuse fun and love. Think with your head and your heart." "Anyway, I thought you said Michelle was a great lover," said Elise. "I think so. But I have no one to compare it to. I have no other experience. I just want to experience it just once before we get married, before I spend my whole life with one man." Kimberly then said what many thought she had said. Her words were cutting and sounded sincere. "If you're not careful with this one, someone else will pick him up. That man is too good-looking and too attractive to let you just play the field and cheat him out of marriage. He'll get himself a warmonger, and then they'll never want to leave, and he probably won't." Silence reigned over everyone again. "I wouldn't make him a cuckold," Hope objected. "I want that for both of us. It would be fair. I would never do something just for me, and I could never humiliate him, disrespect him like that. I've made it clear that if I'm doing this, I'm doing it for him too." "But Hope," Kimberly continued, "that's exactly how it's going to play out, both in his head and in reality. He'll think you're making a cuckold out of him. He'll know it. Everyone will know it, and they'll be right." Most of the girls nodded their heads in agreement with the slightly chubby brunette. Finally, Lila, who had been mostly silent, absorbing all the information and feelings of Hope and the others, spoke. She chose her words carefully for fear they might be misinterpreted. "You've been honest with him, Hope, and he knows you love him. And even a blind man can see that he loves you. You just have to stay strong and true to what you need if you want him to say yes." The others were shocked that Lila was approving of Hope's choice and were about to admonish her, but she nonchalantly continued. "I wouldn't do that, especially with a guy like Michelle. But if you want it so badly, you owe it to yourself to follow through. Stay true to your path. It'll be hard, but I'll help you and Michelle. I love you both. We all do." The others nodded in agreement. "If you need to do this, if you must do this, and if we cannot advise you to do this, then we must help you make it real, but in a way that will not hurt any of you. It must be done discreetly and respectfully." "But what if they do it and someone decides they like to play and won't stop?" objected Trisha. She took a big gulp as she pondered her next words. "Hope is risking everything. It's too much. You say you want 6 months, but what if one of you wants longer or likes someone else better?" "That's not going to happen. I love Michelle and he loves me." Hope spoke confidently and calmly, but deep down she wasn't so sure. "Neither of us would do that to the other," she said. "He probably didn't think you would either," objected Petra. Silence fell on the group again, and they sat for a long time, thinking about what Hope was up to and how to talk her out of it or help her fulfill her wish. Then, as night fell, the girls drank, reminisced, planned, and strategized. They tried to be as objective as possible, citing the pros and cons of Hope's request. They hugged and cried over and over again. All four friends feared for Hope in her relationship, even as they worked with her to either undermine it or override her demands. As the night went on, however, Hope's resolve strengthened, and more friends were inclined to believe that she could open up the relationship and bring other men into her bed. Next chapter. Michel woke up the next day with a piercing headache. He was exhausted body and soul, and his heart ached as if a dagger had been thrust into it. He called in sick to work as he continued to mull over his choices. He ignored the text messages and phone calls from Hope and her friends that pinged off into the night. He needed to think and plan, and so he couldn't afford to be distracted by the phone. He finally turned it off, telling himself that he could always read the messages and listen to the voicemails the next day. He just didn't feel the need to read them this night, not when clarity of thought was required. However, the messages and calls seemed to reinforce to him that she was being supported by her girlfriends, for they were as thick as thieves. He was hurt that Hope had dragged them into this, used them to weaken his willpower and conspire with her to destroy his relationship. His once warm feelings for them soon began to fade as it became apparent that they were involved in a plan to disrupt his wedding and send Hope into the world of dating and embracing other men, all the while imposing their favors on him. "So, is the plan still on track?" asked Jason as Michelle woke up, sprawled out on the couch. Jason wasn't necessarily Michelle's best friend, although he was certainly close to him and had known him for the past 5 years. No, Jason was offering something else that Michelle needed so badly: real-life experience. Jason was in an open relationship, or ethically non-monogamous relationship, ENM, as it was commonly called. However, his relationship ended violently, with anger, heartache, and blame on both sides. Jason's testimony, albeit biased, was important for Michelle to understand the dangers of this path. Michelle needed to hear, needed to understand. At the very least, he needed a place to stop and talk to someone to talk to. Jason was the perfect fit. "Yeah, I guess so." It took him a moment to answer while he pondered the decision he'd come to the night before. Jason had been surprisingly more forthright than he had expected and took equal blame for his failed relationship with Stacy. He'd given Michelle everything and more than he could have expected, and yet he didn't crucify Hope on the cross of his own failures. "It's going to be hard, very hard. It's going to hurt both of you, really badly. Are you sure? You've only had one night to think it over." Michelle nodded, absent-mindedly chewing on a piece of toast. It was overcooked, almost burnt, and tasted awful and dry. But it filled the hole in his stomach, leaving only a hole in his heart. A hole that would only get bigger by the end of the day. That was enough time. If I had thought about it longer, I would only have delayed the inevitable, and the result would have been the same. While he ate, he looked through the various text messages. The girls begged him not to give up on Hope, to listen to her, to work with her, to be with her. They begged him to come back, not to leave her, but to love her because they were sure she still loved him, maybe even more than before. They were sad for him and for Hope and apologized for the pain he was feeling. But one main thought that kept repeating itself more and more as he read the increasingly desperate messages boiled down to one thing: she needs this. Michelle grimaced and sent a message to Hope: "Be back in an hour." He didn't know if she'd be home or off to work. She was probably as shattered by the turn of events as he was, although she was the one who had set everything in motion. Michael turned his phone off again and tucked it away in his pocket. He didn't want to hear anything from her or her friends, at least not until he got back to his apartment. Jason patted him on the back. "I wish you luck, and if it doesn't work out, my couch is always available." His words were spoken simply and forcefully to his friend. "If you're sure that's what you're going to do, don't back down." Michelle nodded his head in the affirmative and held out his hand to his friend, but Jason didn't. Instead of shaking his hand, he enclosed Michelle in a hug, embracing him with a warmth and tenderness that Michelle hadn't expected. "I'll be there for you if you need me," he repeated. "There's always room for a friend." "Thank you, Jason, for everything." Michelle squeezed him tightly in his arms, with tears in his eyes and a gaping wound in his soul. The drive home passed in silence as he continued to deal with the jumble of emotions and thoughts bubbling up inside him. As he pulled up to the house, he suddenly felt his guts clench, his stomach churn, and his toast felt like it was going to repeat itself. He had to take a few deep, slow breaths to try and calm himself down. But as soon as he did, his heart skipped again. This was going to be the most difficult moment of his life, but he had already made up his mind. his actions, his decision was solid, and he would not waver. As the key turned in the lock, he heard whispers coming from inside and suddenly realized that not only was Hope still here, but so were her friends, or at least some of them. He almost ran away. He didn't want this conversation to take place in the presence of any of them. It was too personal, too important, too sad. And in the end, he thought the fact that she wanted to sleep with other men was too humiliating. Still, cursing himself for his weakness, whether they were here or not, this was his home, at least for the moment. He had a right of entry, and he didn't deserve to be servile and cowardly before him. The door unlocked, and the handle turned. He entered with dignity, with a straight back, shoulders squared, and head held high. They didn't need to see his pain. Before his conversation with Jason, he'd felt trapped, and Hope had made him feel cornered and unable to maneuver. Now he had a semblance of control. Hope, Petra, and Lila waited inside. Their quiet conversation was hushed when he entered. The other girls had left early in the morning for work or university, leaving the three remaining to continue planning for Michelle's eventual return. When they saw him, they were touched. He was strong and confident, walking powerfully and assuredly, but it was obvious that his face was only a mask and he was suffering. "Michelle!" Hope called out, quiet desperation audible in her one-word greeting. She tried to move toward him, but he held up a hand, stopping her approach. "No, Hope, no. We need to discuss this together, alone." He turned to face her friends. "Lila, Petra, I'm sorry about this, but could you please leave? I will not discuss this with anyone here." Hope grabbed her friend's hands as Michelle spoke, in a show of support and gratitude. All three exchanged glances and nodded. "We were just about to leave anyway, Michelle." Petra stood up and headed for the door. "She loves you," she whispered almost imperceptibly to him as she passed. But he didn't give any sign that he heard, didn't acknowledge her words. The door slammed shut behind the departing girls, leaving Hope and Michelle alone. There was no more than a meter or two between them, but it might as well have been an unbridgeable chasm. The silence was deafening. No one could or would speak, and time was running out. Hope bit her lower lip quietly, waiting, wishing Michelle would say something that would let her know that everything was going to be okay, that they were going to be fine. But at the same time, she wanted so badly to speak herself, to beg the man she loved to give in to her request, to give in and submit to her wishes. After all, it would be beneficial to both of them. They would both benefit. They would both be able to enjoy it as a short-term infatuation, as a novelty. And then they would spend the rest of their lives together. Finally, Michelle invited her to the couch and sat down next to the only woman he had ever truly loved. Gently, reverently, he took her hands in his and looked into her eyes, searching them for anything and everything. "Michelle," Hope began. But Michelle shook his head, reassuring her. He held her gaze, looking lovingly into her eyes, getting lost in the love that lurked there, but also teasing her. "Please, Michelle," she began again, but Michelle silenced her again. Leaning forward, he kissed her gently on the lips and felt her shudder. She was so soft, so perfect. Her lips were hot and wet, and he could feel her breathing in ragged thrusts. "I agree," he finally said, and Hope's heart nearly burst. She embraced him fully, almost swallowing his larger figure into her smaller one, and wrapped her arms around the man in front of her. "However," he continued, slowly releasing himself from her arms around him. She tensed, suddenly startled by his next words. "There are a few conditions that are non-negotiable. First of all, let me state that you've backed me into a corner and left me no choice. If I don't agree, I'm sure you'll end up cheating on me." She tried to deny it, gasping and shaking her head violently. "I'm sure you will." "Oh, you'll hide it from me, or at least try to. But then you'll lose even more respect for me, which will completely ruin our relationship. This desire is too strong for you, or you wouldn't be talking about it. It will gnaw at you until you give in, and then where will it stop? When will it stop? Alternatively, I could just agree to all your demands, but that would leave me with nothing. You're a beautiful woman. You could go out on the street right now and find someone. How can I compete with that? We'd be competing on different fields, hell. We'd be playing completely different sports. Or finally, I could break up with you here and now, but that would hurt me deeply, more than you realize, and I'd still be left with nothing. And you'll still go out and have fun with whoever you want. Tears began to roll from his eyes, which elicited a similar reaction from her side as she repeated no over and over again. So this is what will happen if I agree to your outrageous, cruel request. At those words, she trembled with fear. There was a hint of anger and a deep, disturbing desolation in those words. She knew he wouldn't lay a finger on her, but she was afraid not of the physical threat, but of her relationship, her upcoming wedding, her future. The time will be changed from 6 months to 12 months. No, Michelle, the wedding. 6 is all I need, she pleaded desperately, but he silenced her again. 12 months. Like I said, it's non-negotiable. Those are the terms, or we'll just end our relationship here and now, as much as I'd like to do it. Stunned, she nodded while her brain tried to navigate this turn in the road. But if 6 will hurt you, why 12? It doesn't make sense. It does, but the reasons are mine. I don't have to explain to you what's behind it. I don't think you deserve an explanation or deserve one. Michelle spoke like a deeply hurt man, struggling to find the words, trying to articulate without bursting into tears, without sobbing, without letting his guard down or revealing his vulnerable inner world. But we have to be honest, Michelle. Please. But his eyes were cold as he shook his head again. No. You don't have to, just not about this. You've hurt me badly, and this will be your payback. Secondly, we won't be here at this time. The wedding is off, and we're splitting up on a temporary and amicable basis. It will be easier than trying to explain to others why we might be seen in intimate situations with someone else, and it will give us the freedom you seem to want and need so badly. He took her hands in his again, but this time he used the tenderness as a stratagem, deftly removing the wedding ring from Hope's finger with a light movement and tugging gently on it. She screamed as the ring slipped from her hands, but her anguished cry meant nothing to Michelle. He tucked the ring away in his pocket and continued. Since we will be separated, you will not wear my ring. The thought of your amusing yourself with another man by wearing it, and even having it with you, disgusts me. Now she was crying in a steady, endless stream. Third, during this time there will be no communication between us. Nothing. No phone calls, no texts, no social media, no emails, no showing up at other people's houses. No friends to check up on, follow, or stalk each other. We just won't exist in each other's world. She fell silent. No contact for 12 months, not together, or with the love of her life. No, that was unacceptable. They could break up, they would break up. There was no other reasonable explanation. You're leaving me? She moaned, shocked and hurt. But he answered nothing because he was close to tears and had to concentrate on getting his word out. He had to convey to Hope the basics, the rules, and the structure that would surround them for the next year. And finally, you're going to tell anyone who asks the plain truth about why we broke up. You'll tell them that you wanted to have fun with others, that it was your decision. No one will brand me the bad guy in this case. I will not tolerate being seen as the one who broke us up. If I ever hear that you lied or misled people about our breakup, I'm not coming back. No, Michelle, no, I don't want that. I won't agree to that. None of it. Not now, not ever again. In fact, she seethed, and the wheels and gears in her head were turning, trying to get ahead of this unfolding and unmitigated disaster. I don't want this anymore. I don't want to pull away from you or from us. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. I'm really sorry. Really, I'm very, very sorry. He smiled weakly, took his right hand and ran it over her cheek. Even upset, she was still beautiful. She was the most beautiful woman he'd ever known, and he was terribly hurt by her pain, but it was a pain she'd caused herself. The blade of her lust and desire that she had wielded the previous night had been double-edged, and in her haphazard attempts to wield it to cut herself a bigger piece of the pie, she had inflicted grievous wounds on both herself and the man she loved. I'm sorry, Hope, but that's the way it has to be. I don't trust you not to look for other men as soon as I turn my back. I don't trust you at all. How did you think this was going to end? You started talking about wanting other men just a few months before our wedding. You knew the danger. It was obvious from the question you asked Madison. She even warned you of the risks involved. You knew, but you went ahead with the action anyway. And that speaks volumes. It's so important to you that you're willing to risk our relationship, our wedding plans, and our entire future together for your own satisfaction. No, he rose, leaving her on the couch with her pain. This is happening. He moved into the bedroom, carrying 2 suitcases and his gym bags. I'll get everything I need now, and then we'll be done. We're renting an apartment, and nothing I leave behind will be irreplaceable. He paused for a moment, looking around the bedroom, the place where he and Hope entertained. It was a refuge from the outside world, where they could take refuge from the storms around them, where the darkness and horrors of this world could never touch them. But now, as his gaze fell on all the furnishings and trappings of the room, they were alien. They belonged to someone else. What about the rules? She asked. Ishta had suggested a bunch of rules, and strong, reliable communication was essential. How many can we date and how long between dates? Is there anyone off limits? Michelle, we need to address these issues. We need to agree on them. She picked up the notepad and pen she had set aside for just such an occasion. The only rules are what I've already said. Anything else is of no concern to me. You're a grown man, and surely you can handle it. He heard her hoarse sobs, but continued undaunted, though his heart was broken into 1,000 shards that might never be put back together. 1 year from now, he looked at his watch and pressed the button to bring up the date. On May 20th, we will meet at the Brown Street Cafe at noon. He began hastily grabbing the clothes and personal items he would need and want. We will meet, and we can reassess our relationship and determine how to proceed. He didn't look back at her, didn't see her curled up in a fecal ball with her head tucked into her lap and her arms wrapped around herself. And even if he had seen her, at that moment he was no longer concerned about her or the woman he loved. It wasn't that his love had suddenly faded. It was that he couldn't go to her. It was a trap that tied him to her, made him lose his resolve and give up. He steeled himself, protected his heart as best he could, executed the plan he'd come up with Jason's help, and delivered her. Now he was out of Hope's life, at least for the next 12 months. The suitcases and gym bags were finally stowed, and anything he didn't have, he would just buy again. As he started to move them toward the door, he finally looked up at Hope. May 20th, Brown Street Cafe, noon. There was no reply, only a quiet whimper. Hope? He tried hard not to reach for her, not to comfort her. He reminded himself that this whole horrible mess was all her fault. Hope, do you understand? There was still only quiet, choking grief coming out of her mouth in response. He sighed. She was the one who had started this ball rolling down the slope, and now that it was out of her control, she was cracking up uncontrollably. She was dumbfounded by the trajectory and speed at which he hurried away from her, bringing Michelle with him. Grabbing a piece of paper, he wrote the details on it and then, shaking his head, withdrew. I love you, Hope, he repeated as he left their apartment for the last time. This time, she didn't utter a word or make a sound in response. Next chapter. After receiving no response to their messages, Petra and Lila returned late in the afternoon to find the front door unlocked and Hope still curled up on the couch. Her stomach ached from the incessant crying, each sob like broken glass hitting her insides. But she couldn't stop and thought she might never stop. Her friends sat beside her, cuddled sweetly against her, wrapping their arms around her to protect her and give her warmth and love. She didn't help them understand what had happened, though it was clear that whatever had happened was cataclysmic in its degree of destruction. Trisha and Eliza arrived in the early evening, bringing a fair amount of alcohol with them. There was work to be done again the next day, but this disaster deserved to get drunk, and drunk hard. Their friend needed them. To hell with work and university? It took time, delicate but purposeful persuasion, and a lot of alcohol before Hope finally told everything. It was late evening. The girls sat in shock. Michelle's empty closet, the scrap of paper with the hastily scribbled note, the missing wedding ring, and the fact that all their numbers were now blocked by him certainly indicated the finality of his decision. It was all nails in the coffin lid and slamming shut, albeit temporarily, this part of his and her life. And for what purpose? No one dared to think. At 11 p.m., an alert arrived on their phones that the Facebook event for Michelle and Hope's wedding had been updated, the event canceled, and a short, chilling post meant to clear up any questions. Hope and Michelle's wedding has been canceled. Hope asked to take time out of the relationship to explore her desire for other men. She gave Michelle permission to do the same with women of his choice. They agreed to meet in 12 months to reevaluate their past commitments and determine if they had a future. Until then, there was no relationship to contemplate, no wedding to plan or attend. Almost immediately, they noticed an update on his Instagram. He posted a meme with an image of a broken heart and the caption, "When the love of your life tells you that you're not enough for her." "Well," said a shocked Trisha, "Michelle just dropped a couple nuclear bombs. He won't let you drive the narrative. What are we going to do?" There was no response. Everyone was too stunned and alarmed by the rapidly escalating state of affairs. Michelle's thoughts had clearly become available to one and all. Hope would need remediation, and a lot of it. While they pondered, another final message was sent to both platforms. "I've planned a special romantic weekend for Hope and me, booked a room at a lovely guest house in Hunter Valley with all meals included. I don't need it anymore, but if anyone can use it, please let me know." "Damn," was Hope's only response, legitimate and deserved. A beautiful weekend lost, a relationship on the rocks, and 12 months of no contact with the man she loved. "I hope it's all worth it," said a saddened Trisha. Tears glistened in the corners of her eyes. She loved Michelle. He made her friend so happy. He had been kind and considerate, warm and caring, but now Hope's greed and desire had ruined everything. Next chapter. Michael left and found himself traveling without purpose. He was traveling without purpose, aimlessly and haphazardly. He felt lost, and his thoughts were haphazard and dull. Eventually, he found himself traveling down a long, empty road. He had managed to get out of the city, and now he was somewhere in a semi-rural area. He wasn't even sure where he was and decided he needed to get his bearings. He pulled over to the side of the road and got out of the car. He slowly walked around, warming up and assessing his current situation. The enormity of the situation decided to overwhelm him, and he screamed to the heavens. He screamed until his throat and lungs ached, and then he screamed some more. In a burst of rage and emotion, he began kicking rocks and sticks, giving vent to the feelings of terror and emptiness he had kept in the back of his mind ever since Hope had ambushed him the night before. How could she do that to him? To them? Had she ever truly loved him? Staggering, he walked over to the wire fence of the neighboring corral and leaned against one of the thick wooden posts. A cow stood nearby and looked at him with large and indifferent eyes. Michelle could not refrain from smiling sardonically. His life was falling apart, and the cow only wanted to eat grass. While he was watching the calf stepped cautiously out from behind her back, following her mother's blank stare to Michelle. The dejected man made the creatures curious, but they paid no attention to him, slowly moving away in search of greener grass. Yes, he thought. This was it. He should have known and planned for this next step, but he didn't think about more than confronting Hope. As a calf treats a cow, so he would treat his parents. They would protect him, take care of him, and though he was no longer a child and was closer to 30 than 20, he needed them now more than ever. He determined where he was by using the GPS on his phone. The drive to his parents would take about 2 hours, but it was doable, and he would be there by late afternoon. On the way, he called his principal, Gianna Knox. She was an older woman who followed all the rules and was known as a bit of an underdog, but mostly unfair and unreasonable. She was tough but fair and treated everyone equally, no matter who they were. Her reputation was often fueled by those who wanted special treatment but didn't get it. "Hi, Gianna," he began, his voice shaking. He knew this was going to be difficult, potentially humiliating. He prayed that he could maintain some self-respect, some level of decorum, and not cry like a child. "Michelle, you sound terrible. Is everything okay?" If Michelle's voice was weak, Gianna's voice was firm and deep, almost masculine. It was that voice that also contributed to her stern and implacable reputation. "Not really." He felt tears come to his eyes, emotions boiling up inside him again. He swallowed hard, trying to hold them back. "Hope and I broke up. I—" And that was all he managed to say before he started sobbing uncontrollably. So much for pride, he thought. But nothing could hold back the flood of tears now. And he cried and cried. Gianna remained silent, allowing the younger man to pour out his grief. She knew how much he loved Hope, everyone did, and it made sense that he would be in complete distress now. She'd been through a terrible breakup herself when she'd been about his age, and it had scarred her permanently, making relationships difficult, if not impossible, for years to come. And while she didn't know anything about the circumstances yet, the reason was meaningless compared to the fact that something so important and meaningful to the young man was now over. "Michelle," she finally said, when the sobs had subsided enough for her to speak to him meaningfully. "Michelle, I know it hurts, and it feels like the end of the world, but you don't have to worry about anything here at school, okay? I'd check, but I don't recall you taking sick leave for any length of time. Take a few days, a few weeks. Just let me know, okay?" He nodded, but she couldn't see in the car. Finally, he squeezed out a weak, "Thank you." "And Michelle," she continued, softening her voice and trying to sound warm and sailor-like, "if you need to talk, I'm always here for you. Call me anytime, anytime. I know what you're going through. I know how much a breakup can affect a person. You don't have to do this alone." He mumbled something, perhaps a statement, but she wasn't sure. His voice was so soft and filled with such pain. It cut off, and Gianna's heart clenched with pain for the young man. Then, with a sense of ominous apprehension, she began to ponder the implications. What would happen if it became known that he was suddenly free? He was handsome, trim, attentive, and pleasant to be with. She shook her head, realizing that her school would soon turn into a meat market where Michelle would be the main course for all the hungry single and not-so-single female employees. "Damn," she said with a wry smile on her lips. It was nearing dusk when Michelle pulled up in front of his parents' house. They were surprised by his unannounced appearance, and the look on his face made them fear for their son. When he pulled out his belongings without saying a word and entered the house, his mother clutched him in her arms and cried. She saw the pain and knew that his relationship with Hope was in jeopardy. If not over, then the wedding was likely off. He stood for a moment before pulling out of her embrace. "Michelle?" But he waved her away, and his father, Francois, looked at her silently, worry written all over his face. Michelle walked through their house with a mournful gait, as if at a funeral, and headed for his old room. When he'd moved in with Hope years ago, it had been converted into a guest bedroom, and it looked nothing like the one he'd once had. But it was private, with a comfortable bed, and that was all he needed right now. Mikkel closed the door behind him, put his things away in the closet, and collapsed onto the double mattress without undressing. He could hear his mother, John, sobbing outside the door. She wanted so much to go to him, to comfort him, for he was still her little boy. But her father pressed her to him and whispered, "Leave him alone. He'll tell you when he wants to." Michel slept the unbroken sleep of a sufferer, waking only a couple hours later. Lying on his bed, he went over in his mind everything that had happened in the previous 24 hours. The grief was palpable. The resentment that his lover and best friend, the woman he would bet his life on, could deem him inadequate to the point that she needed to be entertained by other men was destroying his insides and his dignity. It was then, in a fit of anger, that he grabbed his phone and made Facebook and Instagram updates. It was a relief, and looking at his work, he smiled regretfully. He had to make sure all of their friends and family knew the truth, because while he demanded that she be honest with everyone, he didn't think he could trust her. Not now. He might never be able to trust her again. Turning off his phone before the calls and messages poured in on him like he knew they should, he sank down on the bed in defeat. His hand reached into his pocket and pulled out the dainty engagement ring he'd bought for Hope just a few months ago. It sparkled in the light of the LED lamp. The single diamond was perfect, the ring was perfect, the gold was perfect. But it was all a lie. It was supposed to signify eternal, unbreakable love and the promise of an endless future for the two of them. Now it was just a beautiful trinket, marred by deceit and duplicity. He tossed it on the side table and then stripped down to his underwear and got under the sheets in Duna. Why didn't she tell me about this before I proposed? Before she said yes? The thoughts whirled through his head, and it wasn't the last time he'd ask himself that question. Next chapter. 2 weeks after their relationship temporarily ended, Hope had slept with another man for the first time. His name was Orlando, a strikingly handsome man with long blonde hair and full of confidence. It took him several nights to get her into his bed after he spotted the beautiful girl surrounded by friends at the Green Room, a nightclub known for loud music, expensive alcohol, and even more expensive entrance fees. It was also infamous for being a great place for pickup. Ever since Michelle had left, Hope had been depressed. Her friends took her out dancing and drinking almost every night to get her out of the depression she was wallowing in, but it was all to no avail. She needed the man she loved, and she couldn't believe that their happy life, their future, was now thrown away. She desperately needed him, and even though he had strictly forbidden her to communicate, she tried anyway. She tried to talk to him at school, to his parents, to his friends. Call after call was deflected, intercepted, or parried by those who surrounded and protected Michelle. Eventually, through persistence and overcoming the storm of obstacles placed in front of her, he answered one of her calls. However, the elation she felt when he finally picked up the phone soon faded. "I told you, no communication." He immediately cut off. This was not the loving, gentle Michelle she knew, but a fierce, cold man. A man who had been deeply hurt. "Michelle, I'm so sorry. I want us to be together again." She pleaded with him, but his resolve was unwavering. "I don't trust you, Hope. I feel like you've been lashing out at me, leading me on. You've never been honest with me. Looking back, I can see it now. You should have told me your doubts before we got engaged." There was a long pause. No one could break the silence. "You broke my heart." "I'm so sorry, Michelle. Please, can we try again?" "And then what about when you feel the need for another man again? When you decide I'm not enough for you? I can't live like this, Hope, expecting you to ambush me again or go behind my back." She cried. "Can't we at least talk some more, please?" He mewed, his heart still full of love for this woman, even though she had crushed him under her heel. She could hear him stuttering, gasping in pain. She wanted to hug him, to love him, and be loved by him. "Please, Michelle. I love you. I miss you." "I miss you too, Hope." His words were soft, and she could tell the fresh wounds were open as much as the old ones. "Once a week? Monday night? Can I call you? Please, Michelle." She was desperate. Even a brief conversation with him was better than no contact at all. He was stubbornly unwilling to communicate with her, and deep down she understood that. She knew he didn't want to know about her life without him. He was protecting himself, protecting his heart and his pride. "Just one phone call, once a week. I can't stand it, not for a year. I need you." "Mondays, then. Call me at 8. He relented, then disconnected. It was a victory. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. And that night, when her friends brought her back to the green room, she was in high spirits. She danced with other men, flirted, had a spark in her, and she and Orlando had a great time that night. You're amazing. His words echoed in her head. She thought of Michelle and inwardly groaned. She had cheated on him. Can you call me a cab? She asked meekly. Orlando nodded. Sure, babe. When do you want to do it again? She didn't answer, but he had her number. She'd given it to him the night before the conquest. She knew he'd call her, and he knew that even though she seemed to have post-coital doubts now, she'd say yes again. Her friends were happy for her, but still saddened. All of them, even Lila, had hoped that she wouldn't go through with it. That she and Michelle could rekindle their relationship and rebuild a foundation of trust and love. After she'd admitted that he'd returned her call and that they'd agreed to start the dialogue anew, there was excitement and anticipation in the air. And then she was drawn to the man. Their words meant nothing. Their attempts to protect her meant nothing. She left with him, and they knew what would happen soon after. I did it, she squealed as everyone gathered the next night. They were in Hope's apartment, the same one she'd shared with Michelle seemingly forever ago. But her words sounded false to everyone. They could see the conflict within. They cheered and clapped and hugged her, wanting to know how it had gone. Had the itch scratched, and could she now end this madness? But even as they talked to her, they knew Hope would be back for more. Next chapter. Eventually, Michelle moved away from his parents and back into Jason's furnished spare room. He needed to be closer to work, and his parents lived too far away. Mom and Dad, especially Jean, had urged him to try to patch things up with Hope. To make every effort to get her to change her mind, not just give in to her demands. They made no secret of the fact that they were disappointed, but his mother believed that Hope was simply afraid of the wedding, as if it was a weight that would soon be tied to her leg, holding her in place. Fear of such a long-term commitment was not unusual, though her way of dealing with it was unusual and self-destructive. But Michelle didn't heed his parents' pleas. He knew that deep down it wasn't fear, but lust. Things must take their own course, for better or worse. Michelle and Hope continued to talk on the phone, every Monday at 8 o'clock. Even if she wasn't feeling well, or depressed, or had other feelings swirling around in her head, she still made sure she was home, alone, and called. She always called, never him. Their conversation started out tentative and a little wordy, but over time they opened up, becoming closer to what they had been before, but never reaching that level of intimacy and familiarity. Michelle immediately demanded that if they were going to talk, all talk of their dating was off limits. He didn't want to hear about who she was sleeping with, not even that it was happening, as he was sure it was. For her part, she was grateful to him. She couldn't hear about his partners either, though it had started with her actions, her desires, and she had insisted he do the same. Realizing that the man she loved was likely enjoying other women, Hope shuddered, feeling nauseous and sad. But that was what she wanted. The thought and realization terrified her. Their breakup had been going on for 6 months now. Hope had a string of steady lovers. With the help of her friends, she tried not to dwell on anyone. They feared that intimacy might undermine the ultimate goal of winning Michael back and becoming his wife. After 2 more dates, Orlando moved on to other women, and she dated 9 men. Some were good, some were disappointing and discarded after one night. One was exceptional. His name was Ty. Michelle, as Gianna had feared, had become the centerpiece of the greedy frenzy at their school. Affairs and casual liaisons were not uncommon, even among married or committed staff members. But when Michelle suddenly returned to the market, the very eligible bachelor was once again the center of attention. He dated many, and if rumors were to be believed, slept with many. But he still remained elusive, and no one seemed to be able to keep him away. If Hope cast him aside, many others were ready to pick him back up. Our wedding is in 3 weeks, Hope said wistfully one Monday, engaging in her weekly conversation. They'd been talking for almost an hour, and she kept looking at the calendar on the wall, where the date was clearly circled with brightly colored rings and love hearts. She wept, something she hadn't done in a long time. Michelle, I want this craziness to stop. I want us to go back. Please come back to me. I hate this. There was a pause on the other end of the wire, a sharp intake of breath, and she regretted mentioning the wedding and her desire to have him back in her life. She didn't want to pressure him. After a moment's introspection, she thought she'd done enough of that earlier in the year, when her hunger for other experiences had led them into this spiral of self-pity and loneliness. The line snapped. Shit! Her scream was loud and sudden, so much so that she shocked herself. Even more so when she found that the tears weren't just pooling in the corners of her eyes, but were free-flowing, pouring uncontrollably down her cheeks and falling onto the bed. The pain was suddenly back to the same level it had been the first time they'd broken up, burning deep inside her. She was in pain. Experiencing the pain made her do something she swore she would never do. On their night with Michelle, she'd made a phone call. Ever since he'd agreed to talk to her, Mondays had become sacred. They had to be alone together, so they had something to hold on to. Hope had always gently turned down anyone who asked her for companionship on those evenings, but now that she was destitute and feeling rotten and unloved, she needed to do something. She needed to let go of her pain. She needed Ty. Hey, babe, he answered the second call. What's up? I thought you weren't free on Mondays. Was it a night with your ex? With an ex. That hit a nerve. She'd never called Michelle her ex, but she'd told the story, albeit succinctly. She'd always been honest with those she'd been with and let them know that no long-term relationship was imminent. Her heart still belonged to Michelle, and she fully intended to give it back to him and be faithful when they met again at the Brown Street Cafe. I need you, Ty. And how could he say no? He was there in record time. He was the only one she'd ever brought back, the only one she'd ever defiled Michelle's bed with. He'd been there many times, but tonight would be the first time she'd be with him on Monday, Michelle's night. Next chapter. Michael could clearly hear a male and female voice. Michelle held the wedding ring in his hand, wanting to put it back on her finger to right his wrongs, to win back her love and her hand. But now he felt the long-forgotten dagger thrust back into him, deeper than ever. Its blade red-hot. She was calling to him, asking him to become hers again, to end the separation and restore their love. But it was a lie. She didn't want him at all. Michelle froze in place, listening, his insides twisting into knots. It was all a lie. He tore a page out of the notebook he'd written the date and time on many months ago and wrote a new note for her. I thought you wanted me back to fix our relationship. I was wrong. You lied. I guess I'm an idiot and you're a bitch. Here's your wedding ring. I don't need it anymore. Michelle didn't sign it. She didn't need to. She already knew who it was from. He put the note and ring on the kitchen bench where she was bound to see them, and with a heavy heart, he left. He left without shedding a tear. He told himself there would be no more tears, not for her, not in this life. Lila was waiting for him when he came out of school and headed to his car in the teacher's parking lot. She was sitting on the hood of his I-30 when he saw her and froze. It had been a little over 3 weeks since that fateful night when he had returned to the apartment and found Hope and Ty there. He had cut off contact with her again, blocked her number, and threatened to sue her if she continued to harass him. The threat was unreasonable, but he was counting on her not finding out about it. "You're an ass, Michelle!" Lila shouted at him. "This woman loves you!" "Back off, Lila. Hope and I broke up. It's over. There's no going back." When he went back to Jason's place that night, it hurt terribly, but he held back. As much as it hurt to harbor the grief inside him, he didn't let it out, didn't let it consume him. Jason saw right through him. Their friendship had grown over the months, going from good friends to great friends, and from great friends to better friends. Michelle relied on Jason, leaned on him, and Jason helped when he could, as much as he could. "I told you not to go," Jason said once he was back, immersed in himself, and once Michelle had told the story about Hope and her lover. "But you didn't listen. That's how it always ends. Jealousy, rage, a terrible sense of inadequacy. In an open relationship, someone always suffers. People claim it's not true, but deep down it is." When the person you love wants intimacy with others rather than you, gets more pleasure from intimacy with them, avoiding pain is impossible. You wouldn't be fully human if it didn't hurt you. You had a 12-month plan, and you should have stuck to it. Now Lila was here to reprimand him for picking a fight in his workplace. I'm not going back to her. She's devastated. She didn't know you were going there or she wouldn't have invited that asshole. She hasn't seen him since. She hasn't seen anyone since, she pleaded with her friend, but her words fell on deaf ears. You can't be upset because you went in there. You went in there unannounced. He snorted. You can't just show up at someone's house and expect them to sit there waiting for you. You had to. It's still my apartment, Lila. My name is still on the lease. I had every right to go there. Not to mention that less than an hour before, she begged me to go back. And I went because I was weak, because I was stupid. He opened the door and put his laptop and bag of textbooks on the passenger seat. It won't happen again. Go away. She needs you. It was a mistake. She thought you had... He interrupted her again, rage rising in his voice. It doesn't matter what she thought. I don't care anymore. Now please leave me alone. I have a date tonight, and I don't want it ruined by thinking about that bitch. Lila slid off the hood of his car and walked over to him, wanting to give him a friendly, heartfelt hug, but he pulled away. Please don't touch me, Lila. Just go away. Lila shouldn't have been shocked by his behavior, but she couldn't help it. She tried to speak without emotion, but a faint sigh escaped her lips. You might have a date with Hope. She wants you back. She needs you back. She almost never stops crying. When she realized you were there, that you saw them together, she was absolutely mortified. Please, Michelle, don't give up on her. You're better than that. I said no, Lila. Not now, not ever again. His hands trembled, though his voice was firm and unyielding. His words and body emphasized different emotions, and Lila didn't miss it. He slid into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. Lila screamed at him, but he ignored her, started the car, and drove out of the parking lot, moving away from her. He started taking long, slow, deep breaths. He needed to calm down, to regain control of himself. Indeed, he had a date with a blonde nurse named Meredith. He'd met her 2 months after their first separation and had met her in passing a few times. He'd also managed to sleep with her twice. But now that the door to his and Hope's relationship had been carefully closed, locked and nailed shut, he was contemplating a more serious relationship with her. His 12-month plan was back in action. Maybe she'll put on her work uniform? He thought to himself, turning a frown into a smile as he drove. The anticipation of the evening was stirring him, making him excited and nervous in a way he hadn't been in a long time. Lila pulled out her phone and called Hope, watching Michelle disappear into the distance. There's still a chance, even though he doesn't want to admit it. He's in pain, terrible pain. She heard a quiet cry on the other end of the wire, but didn't say another word before disconnecting. Next chapter. Hope's friends continued to stalk Michelle at least a couple times a week. He was all too aware of it. He'd seen them many times, and they weren't good at trying to hide. So he found himself lingering in his office more and more often, working at school until dusk, or leaving early to avoid those waiting or following him. He often noticed someone following him on dates, or even stalking him when he was just out with friends. It was becoming unbearable and unforgivable. It was now the beginning of April, a little over a month away from the date the two former lovers were to meet at the Brown Street Cafe. After Hope had stopped by Ty's house, he had completely cut off communication again. All calls immediately dropped, whether from her or any of her associates, and more numbers were now permanently blocked. He had new email addresses that he used exclusively on his own, only occasionally checking the old ones, and he deleted from friends or blocked anyone guilty on his social media accounts. He went so far as to almost completely disassociate himself from Facebook and Instagram, and kept in touch with his friends through other, more private channels. Michel also took himself off the lease, much to Hope's dismay and trauma. When he moved out of the apartment, it was done inadvertently, but he decided to leave it as is, hoping he could move back in. now that no longer seemed possible or plausible. And finally, the weak link turned out to be his mother, Jean. "Hi, Mom," he answered when she called one evening. "How are you?" "Please don't hang up, Michelle," came Hope's voice. Gritting his teeth, he held back his verbal tirade, but didn't say anything back. A moment passed, then another. Hope spoke again. "I just want to ask you one question." She lingered, waiting. There was still no answer. "Michelle, are you still here?" He grunted. "Michelle, I just need to know. I just need to know if you still intend to date me next month. That's all." Hope begged desperately, begged the man she still loved, and who she hoped still loved her. "Will you be there? At noon?" She heard a sigh full of regret and resignation. "Please, Michelle. I miss you. I miss us. I need you to be with me again." "Yes." Just one word before he ended the conversation. But his head was spinning at the brazenness and audacity of her appeal, her entitlement. What angered him most was where it was coming from. He immediately called his father. The phone only rang once before it was picked up. "Hello, Michelle," his father, Francois, answered with a note of caution. "I know you're upset, but your mother—" He didn't stop there. "I told you and Mom not to get involved. And now this slut is calling from Mom's phone?" Michelle was beyond furious as he screamed into the receiver. "Son, she's here with us now." Francois's voice lowered to a barely audible whisper, but it remained disturbing, though it was filled with warmth and love. "She's been coming here for weeks. I know we promised not to interfere when you two postponed the wedding, but she's afraid. She's afraid, son. Afraid you won't want her back. She's unhappy and lonely and afraid. She hasn't dated anyone in a long time." "What if I don't want her back?" Michelle demanded. "What if I've already withdrawn? What if I don't think I can trust her? What's more, I know I can't trust her. You have no right." He heard her in the background talking to his mother. Then the voices suddenly stopped, and one of them uttered a faint question. "Michelle? Michelle, I know you're hurting. But don't let your pride get in the way of your happiness. Until all of this happened, you were the happiest I've ever seen you. You and Hope, we all know you were meant to be together. You've both spent some time apart and hurt each other, but now it's time." He didn't stop there. Michelle disconnected from his father and then blocked both parents' numbers. "Hell!" he shouted. Couldn't he trust anyone? When he finally got back to Jason's place, his friend was waiting for him with a cold beer and a smirk. Michael nearly threw his bags across the room. He was still worked up, tense, and ready to explode. He didn't even say a word to Jason as he snatched the beer from him and began to empty it. It burned his throat slightly with its bitter flavor and chilled him wonderfully. He tossed the bottle into the trash can, and Jason held out another, which met the same fate. "Your mom called here." "Screw her," grinned Michelle, heading off in search of a third serving. "I totally understand, but don't let it upset you. You're happy, aren't you? With the plan, with your successes. And that old life, is it done and buried already? Do what you need to do, what you want to do. Don't let it knock you down." Jason patted him on the back to comfort him and gently remind him that Michelle had always expected things to go exactly as he'd thought they would all those months ago. "If you're so upset now, then what was all the previous pain for?" Michelle nodded. "I'm not upset about Hope having fun, not anymore. It's about the boundaries she crosses. My parents, my job, my friends, my dates. She continues to disrespect me at every turn. I've asked her to respect my wishes for 12 months. Just 12 months. He sipped his beer slowly this time, a smile spreading across his face. "But I'm happy. Really, I'm happy. I'm happy that I have a great job, good friends, and hopefully a beautiful, loving girlfriend waiting for me at the end. I'm happy that this will all be over soon and I can look forward to the future. Do you want to go out? The guys can meet us at the Crown." Jason loved the Crown and Squires, a local pub that was a short walk from his apartment. "Sounds like a great place. Just let me finish this one first," he grinned, taking another sip of his third beer in the last 10 minutes. There would likely be a live band at the Crown tonight to complement the overpriced schooners. But if his friends would be there, and it was Friday night, why not? He could sleep all day tomorrow with a hangover, and no one would care. He finished his drink and changed into jeans, a midnight oil t-shirt, and casual shoes, while Jason continued to chat about his new girlfriend. Ever since his relationship with Stacy had failed catastrophically, Jason wanted nothing more than casual hookups for easy companionship and fun. Jason was a man who burned himself badly. He never stayed with any woman longer than 3 months, but he was always honest with his new partners about his lack of long-term commitment. His relationship with Heidi was new, was in its second week, and he was clearly still at the stage of wanting to see her and be with her, though Michelle knew he would soon cast her aside like everyone else. The walk to the Crown took about 10 minutes, and they passed the local diner, the Greasy Spoon. Since Michelle hadn't eaten yet and had already had 3 beers, Jason nudged him inside. It wouldn't hurt to get some refreshment before the heavy night ahead. 2 Chico rolls, 2 fish and batter, and $4 worth of fries, thanks. Jason handed the order to the daughter of the Vietnamese couple, running the place, and handed over a 20. Keep the change, buy yourself something nice. She was young, incredibly thin, bordering on anorexia and a real chatterbox. However, she spoke good English, something her parents had trouble with, and so in the evenings she took orders and translated for her workaholic parents. Jason and Michelle felt sorry for her, because at such a tender age, she was constantly working long hours. In addition, Michelle, as a teacher, feared for her education. Her workday left almost no time for studying and grades. "Michelle," the girl addressed him. "That woman was here again last night." Michelle felt his blood turn icy in his veins. "Heh!" She was asking how often you come here and when you usually go to the pub. He sighed and sank heavily onto one of the flimsy but surprisingly sturdy white plastic chairs that stood along the wall. "I don't believe in this. I just don't believe it. Why can't they leave me alone?" The woman was most likely Trisha. She lived nearby, and it wasn't a long drive to get here. She'd been to the Crown more than once before, and seemed to have her eye on the fish and chip store. Maybe, he thought, stopping socializing was a mistake. If he kept socializing, it would stop the stalking and harassment. "Don't let it overwhelm you, buddy." Jason slipped the newspaper-wrapped food into Michael's hands. "It's almost over, and you can get back to your life, right?" Michelle wasn't sure of that, and only made a sound like a grunt and a sigh. "This 12-month period was your idea, remember, Michelle. And no matter how things turned out, you've been blowing off that hot nurse for a while now, not to mention that administrator from your school. She was okay too. How about that young gym teacher? I mean, P.H. War." Michelle didn't seem convinced, so Jason continued. "You and Hope? Well, I get it. It hasn't been happy sailing. She has boyfriends and you have girlfriends. Take it as a win. Don't worry about the other stuff. It's just them being desperate. You have another month before you decide what you're going to do, whether you're going to stay with Hope or move on. Either way, trust yourself and ignore them." Jason took a bite from one of the Chico rolls. The big, greasy, deep-fried appetizer, similar to a spring roll, had already made the waxed paper shell partially transparent. Oh, shit!" he exclaimed. "Damn hot." He waved his hand in front of his mouth, as if that could magically put out the fire inside, and Michelle was left only to laugh merrily. From behind the counter, the girl and her mother also joined in the laughter at Jason's expense. It took about 15 minutes to eat their portion of fat, butter, salt, and lots of carbs, during which Jason talked at length about Heidi. "I think she might be the one." A dreamy expression came over Jason's face. He hadn't felt this excited and optimistic about a woman since Penny had shown up 5 months ago. She had lasted a full 6 weeks before Jason decided one morning that he didn't like the way she snored. The irony made Michelle shudder. Jason snored like a rusty robot juggling poorly tuned chainsaws. It was so loud that it could easily be heard from the other room and through 2 closed doors. "I think I want to be exclusive with her, Michelle." I want to have a real relationship with her. He looked at Michelle, who was stuffing the last of his chips into his mouth, and grinned. Is it inappropriate to propose after only 2 weeks? Michelle almost choked on his chips, which made Jason laugh. I'm kidding, Michelle. Muttering an ew, Jason continued. I'm going to wait until at least 3 weeks. He playfully slapped Michelle's bicep. Come on, Casanova. There's probably another girl at Corona who'll want to get you. Jason laughed, looking at his friend. Let's find you a couple more pussies before your vacation is called off. Michelle clapped him lightly on the shoulder, and they walked towards the pub, towards drinks, and possibly something more exotic. The Shadowboxer were indeed the band playing at the Crown that night. They were a cover band of the Angels, but also performed many songs by other well-known Australian artists. Their performance of Am I Ever Gonna See Your Face Again, in particular, drew a lot of support from the growing crowd, as is always the case with this song. And Michelle, like everyone in attendance, shouted the song's unofficial additional lyrics at the top of her voice. Will I ever see your face again? The singer asked, enthusiastically repeating a lyric from the late, great Doc Neeson. No way, screw you! Shouted the crowd in response. And so it went on over and over again. In a way, it was cathartic. The lyrics were mournful, about lost love. But the crowd was responding on behalf of someone who was gone. And Michelle felt it, felt the words echo deep inside him. Who would he be? The one who yearns and is alone, or the one who runs away? As the last notes echoed and the crowd began to cheer, Michelle felt someone wrap their arms around him from behind and enclose him in an unwelcome embrace. He froze, contemplating the worst possible scenario. A sideways glance at one of his friends, Chaz, told him it was bad. Hope, he began as she whirled on him. But it wasn't hope. Instead, Trisha's sweet face appeared before him. Her blonde hair was slicked back, and underneath an old and faded AC/DC t-shirt, she wore a man's red and black plaid shirt, unbuttoned but tied at the waist. You have a good voice for a drunk, Michelle. She tokenized with a smirk on her lips. Will you dance with me? She saw his hesitation before he even did. I won't talk about Hope, I promise. I just want to dance. I may be Hope's friend, but I'd still like to think I'm your friend too. I just saw you here, and in times past you would have danced with me by now. True, Hope had never liked to dance, but Trish liked it, and often he would go out on the parquet with her if she was between suitors. But now he just stared at her, not knowing what to say back. Trisha didn't expect an answer, though, taking his absence as acquiescence. It didn't matter, though. She wasn't going to take no for an answer anyway. As soon as the band started playing the next song, a driving and rumbling cover of The Poor's hit, More Wine, Please Waiter, she dragged him to the small and tightly packed dance floor. When one song ended, he found himself staying with her for another and another. Her smile grew, but deep down, he knew it was wrong. This was obviously another reconnaissance mission, and he was beginning to be annoyed by the recklessness of her actions. Finally, he pushed her away and started to turn back to his friends, but she grabbed his arm and pressed herself against him with all her might. Michelle, please! He pulled her hands away easily, shaking his head as he did so. You all need to stop following me. The more you do it, the less desire I have to go out with Hope again. You're accomplishing the exact opposite of what you want. She snuggled up to him with a cry of, What? The band started a new song, and it became almost impossible to hear each other. Michelle sighed and motioned for Trisha to follow him outside. He needed to talk to her, needed to get her and the others away from himself. Their constant interference in his life was unacceptable. He had come here with his friends to have fun, relax, and not think about anything in particular. He definitely didn't want to relive painful memories and heartbreak again. Trisha nodded in response to his gesture, and grasping his hand again, followed him to the exit. As they passed Jason, he smiled ingratiatingly and winked, which elicited an angry look from Michael. Trisha, that's not nice. He reprimanded the woman as they stood at the entrance to the Crown, inside which the noise of the band was still there, but no longer deafening. No, Michelle, it's not. That shocked him. He hadn't expected her to react like that, to agree with him so easily. He was confused. Very confused. Then what's your game, Trisha? What are you doing here? Not playing, Michelle. I was bored and lonely, so I came here to drink and dance and maybe try my luck. And then I saw you. I missed you, you know. We all missed you. We were friends once. She had a sad expression on her face, like someone coming to terms with impending death or a passing that can't be prevented. I know you don't want to talk about it, and I won't. But can we stay friends for this night at least? Just the two of us. Just friends. There were tears in her eyes. Michelle had always liked Trisha, and not just because she was one of the closest friends of the woman he loved. She was genuine. For a long time, he felt protective of her. She had had so many failed boyfriends and lovers. She had a habit of dating jerks and losers, and he took her pain and loneliness as a bitter pill. He wanted her to be happy, just like he was, or was. Friends, he said finally, for today. Michelle extended his hand for a handshake to formalize their truce. Trisha, however, enclosed him in a tight hug, whispering, "Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. Come on." She loosened her embrace, but took his hand and pulled him back, leading him into the house. "Dance with me one more time." Next chapter. Michelle opened his eyes tiredly. His head was splitting from the booze and loud music, and the light coming through the upstairs window told him it was late evening. He groaned and rolled over onto his back, trying to determine the best way to leave the bed and start saving what was left of the daylight. And then he realized that getting out of bed wasn't going to be easy. It was going to be very difficult and awkward. Next to him was Trisha. Michelle was stunned. Was it really him? Could it really be them? He couldn't continue. How could this have happened? Really? His question was rhetorical. That much was obvious, and his memory was finally working again. She nodded. The expression on her face was curious. Happiness, satisfaction, confusion, anger, resentment, and guilt all played on it. But how could this have happened? Why did it happen? She nodded. I know, but I trust you, Michelle. In a way I don't trust anyone else. Next chapter. Trisha, Elise's voice was stern, almost accusatory. My cousin was there last Friday at the Crown. Tell me that's not true, please. Trisha bowed her head. Even though she'd told Michelle it was for one time before he went back to Hope, they'd seen each other twice more. And both times it had ended the same way. And both times she'd said it wouldn't happen again. And yet this night she was to meet him again. Oh my God. There was desperation in Elise's voice. What's wrong? Asked Kimberly, glancing from one to the other. What's going on? Trisha took a deep breath. She couldn't hide it, couldn't deny it. I slept with Michelle. Silence hung in the air at the table. Elias, Trisha, and Kimberly had gathered for lunch on Thursday at their favorite diner to chat. They had often talked about Hope and Michelle before, but now it seemed to be about Trisha and Michelle. The roll with the halloumi salad no longer seemed appetizing to Trisha. The shame of her act burned her cheeks scarlet, and she tossed her lunch back onto the paper plate. You what? I hooked up with Michelle, okay? I just ran into him and we became friends. Just as friends. Just as friends. Bullshit, Elise hissed. Hannah saw you with him. Trisha nodded, looking at her feet. How could you? How could you betray Hope? Eliza was furious. I thought you were her friend. Trisha gathered her courage. She wasn't going to put up with this. What had happened was Hope's fault. That stupid, self-righteous girl. You know Hope was having fun with Glenn and Tony, right? She threw the words back at her friends. Hope threw Michael aside. He's a great guy and he deserves better. He doesn't deserve to be disrespected like that. But you're her friend. Elise's harsh words didn't match the look on her face. She was devastated. If news of this got back to Hope, it would crush her. Hope made some mistakes, but she's trying to make things right. She's not fooling around anymore. She's staying true to Michelle because she loves him. She wants him back. And that's... Was he good? Kimberly couldn't help herself. Michael was handsome and fit, and if Hope was to be believed, especially compared to many she'd had in the last 11 months, he was a fantastic lover. Trisha smiled, but it was a damned smile. He was better than just good. Who's better? They turned, shocked. Hope was standing behind them with a box of lettuce in her hands and a cheeky grin on her face. "Oh my God!" she wailed when she saw Trisha's face. "Who were you having fun with? Do I know him?" And there was silence in the group, and each of them found something to do. None of them could look Hope in the eye. None of them could hide their discomfort. Hope's smile faded. "Who were you having fun with?" This time the question sounded demanding but wistful. "Trisha, tell me, who?" The silence that ensued said all that needed to be said. "Who was he, Trisha? Tell me." She was squealing now, drawing the full attention of the small restaurant. Tears were streaming down her face. She knew. She knew. She just didn't want to believe it, didn't want to put up with it. These were her friends. They were supposed to be on her side, supposed to help her get back the man she loved. How could they? How could she? Trisha was her best friend. The one friend she trusted more than any other. Without warning, Hope smashed a salad box into Trisha's face, and she lunged at her friend with her fists. Hope hit Trisha over and over, screaming like a banshee who'd been wronged. Trisha tried to cover herself, tried to defend herself, but the attack was intense, relentless, and full of rage and anger. It took 3 more customers, as well as Kimberly and Eliza, to pull her away and hold her still. "I'm sorry, Hope. I really am." She shook the rest of the salad out of her hair and walked away with her head down. "Did you really have fun with Glenn and Tony?" Kimberly turned to Hope as soon as Trisha left, and couldn't believe she didn't know that. "Did you really let 2 of Michael's so-called friends drool all over you?" She shook her head, looking at Hope and her actions with disgust. "And you're upset because Trisha entertained Michelle. Don't be a hypocrite, Hope. This whole thing, this whole mess, it was all your idea. It's all on your conscience. Remember?" She hurriedly withdrew, running after Trisha. If they started figuring out sides now, as the end approached, things would be even worse than they were. They needed solidarity. They needed honesty. They needed to get their heads together and not fight. Kimberly was going to try to solve this problem. She needed to bring them back together and keep them from being torn apart. But if the battle lines were drawn, she wouldn't side with Hope. She couldn't. Not now. Next chapter. "You're going back to her?" Trisha clutched Michelle in her arms. "No," Trisha cried. "I'm so sorry, Michelle." He shook his head gently and pushed her hair back from her beautiful but battered face. "I'm so sorry, too." Glenn and Tony. Did Michelle know? How would he take it? She swallowed hard. She had to tell him that his friends had betrayed him the way she had betrayed Hope. "Michelle." She looked up at him and saw his pain. This whole sad situation has affected him deeply. He was a good man whose only fault was his love for a woman he was obsessed with. "Michelle, I need to tell you something." He nodded for her to continue. "Glenn and Tony..." She tried to say it, tried to get it out, but the words stuck in her throat. Hope, she made Glenn and Tony. They made her a team. A tear leaked out of his eye and ran down his cheek. "Thank you, Trisha." Now the strange looks he'd gotten from them in the previous months made sense. He sighed. He couldn't blame them. He'd been the one who'd refused to set ground rules with Hope when this whole thing had blown up. He'd been the one who'd refused to discuss the breakup. It was his words that came back to him, and it was his words that set all of these events in motion. "The only rules are what I said. Everything else is of no concern to me." He could still hear them in his mind. He was reviewing them now. He was angry, full of bile and spite, and he didn't stop to listen to her, didn't stop to discuss it with her. He simply spat out his demands in her direction and then walked away, regardless of the consequences. "Thank you, Trisha," he repeated. "I don't mind." She was free to be with whoever she wanted to be with. No questions asked. Just like I was free to be with whoever I wanted to be with whoever I still want to be with. He looked down at her and smiled. "And I want you, Trisha. I want you." "That would destroy her, Michelle. She loves you." "I love her too. But not like this, no more. She'll recover and hopefully she won't make the same mistakes. I hope she gets rid of this and can find someone new." He pulled her tighter against him. He'd known Trisha for years, loved her deeply, but not romantically. Now, however, even though they had crossed that line only a few days ago, he knew his love for her had changed irrevocably. He didn't have to learn to love her, learn to recognize her. He already loved her. "Trisha, I love you!" She cried terrible tears. Her heart ached. So many lives would be touched by that simple statement. Many would be shattered, years of friendships would be severed, and they might never be put back together again. She picked up her phone and texted Kimberly. Responded to an earlier message she had received after the incident at the sandwich store. "I love him." Next chapter. It was May 20 noon. Hope sat quietly, knowing she had already been judged. The Brown Street Cafe was bustling with activity. People were in and out, snacking, eating lunch, and drinking coffee. Outside, Eliza and Lila waited with desperate but ultimately pointless optimism. Kimberly and Trisha had abandoned her to her fate. She knew why. It stung her. She hadn't spoken to Trisha since she'd attacked her former friend. Aside from her dead friendship with Trisha, she'd only spoken to Kimberly in passing since it was clear that the sides had been split. Kimberly had tried, but it had all been in vain. Hope didn't want to listen, and Trisha walked away from Michelle. Hope fondly twirled the engagement ring that sat on the third finger of her left hand. She'd worn it reverently since Michelle had left it at her apartment after that unfortunate night when she'd succumbed to Ty begging him to own her. It was the last vestige of the former life, the happiness she had once had. Time flew by unnoticed. It was already 12:15, and he was still gone. He had promised, but he wasn't there. Just as she had promised to be only his, but then wanted more. She cried, swatting at her coffee. "Are you okay, honey?" Hope looked into the older woman's eyes. She was in her early 60s. There was a gentle, caring, and concerned expression on her face. She shook her head. No, she wasn't okay. She was broken. She had lost the man she loved and two good friends, possibly forever, and the effects had spread throughout her universe, changing everything and everyone they touched. The older lady sat down, unasked and uninvited, and put her arm around the younger woman. "Man trouble?" she asked. Hope nodded. "Heartbreak?" Hope nodded again. "Your fault or his?" Hope lifted her head. She could barely speak. The stranger's warmth enveloped her. This woman shouldn't have been doing this, wasting her time comforting an unknown person. But she was comforting. Tears even appeared in her eyes, reflecting Hope's anguish. "It's my fault. I threw it away." The older woman sighed, but hugged her anyway. She held her for what seemed like an eternity without saying a word. She just held her so that comfort and compassion flowed into Hope. "Hello, Hope." Both looked up and saw Michelle. He was elegantly dressed in a suit and tie, handsome and suave. His jaw showed the beginnings of a beard, and his hair was impeccably groomed. "Sorry I'm late." He nodded to an elderly lady who patted Nadezhda gently on the back in a motherly manner. Michelle extended a hand to her, helping her to her feet. Glancing over at the two young men, she shook her head sadly. What a shame. They looked perfect together, though she could see that the man had withdrawn into himself and the woman was still grieving. "I wish Hope luck," she said as she walked away. "May I?" Michelle pointed to the empty seat across from his former love. Hope nodded again. "Please." Her voice was hoarse and uneven. She could barely look at him. Her heart and soul were in pain beyond all imaginable limits. For a while they sat without speaking. Michel contemplated the woman standing before him, the woman who only 12 months ago had seemed to be his life partner. Hope, for her part, tried to avoid his gaze, tried not to look at him. She absent-mindedly twirled Michel's ring, a dedication to his love, now gone, lost. You and Trisha? She finally succeeded. He nodded. Marriage? He shrugged. Maybe. We haven't talked about it yet. It's still early. He reached across the table to her and took her hands in his. It's time to forget me, he said, removing the ring from her finger again. It's not healthy, he remarked, holding the ring in his hand. It's not helpful. Leave it off. She snapped. I love you, Michel. Please come back to me. The shake of his head was another nail in the lid of her coffin, sealing the fate of a future without him. No, Hope. You have to accept this and move on with your life. You're a wonderful, wonderful person. We've both made mistakes, but there's no reason to let them hold you back. You're young. You won't be alone for long. She collapsed and cried, and he sat there looking at her in silence. There was compassion in his eyes and love in his heart. But it was different now. He belonged to someone else. He stroked her hair gently. If we had only lived for 6 months like I wanted, we would still be together. She whispered the words, muffled by the arms that encircled her head. Perhaps, he replied stoically and idly, but I would never trust you again, and our relationship would be doomed either way. 12 months? She raised a pleading look at him. Why 12 months? He smiled bitterly. I needed time to sort out my feelings and maybe move on. To realize what happened to us. 6 months, he shrugged. Wouldn't have been enough. I'd still be too hurt by what you did, by what you said, by what you needed. I needed to be apart from you longer so I could heal or decide to take you back. You always knew it would end this way, didn't you? No, I didn't know, but I suspected. He stopped and stood, tucking the ring he'd once given her into his pocket, and then returned in anger. He was convinced that keeping it in his possession was harmful. He didn't want her to be hurt, didn't want her to dream that they could be together again. That relationship didn't exist anymore. It was over between them. The idea of dating other people belonged to you, Hope. You took it unilaterally. Up until that point, I was happy. Trisha misses you. The last words, and he was gone. Moments later, her 2 remaining and loyal friends were at her side, sympathizing and crying together. Love had been lost. Her love. Defeated. Next chapter. Michel and Trisha's romance continued to soar to new heights, and their former friendship was the foundation on which it was built. But the consequences of that relationship were far-reaching. To her horror, Trisha found that both Petra and Lila now shunned her, and although Kimberly chose to support the 2 new lovers, that relationship too became strained. Kimberly felt that she was caught in the middle and couldn't hide her frustration that everything was falling apart. A week later, when Michel and his friends gathered at the park to throw balloons, he was confronted by Glenn and Tony, while Jason and the others backed him up. I hear you guys like sandwiches, he began, receiving confused looks from both of them in return, with hope filling. Realizing that the situation had changed and their secret was out, they backed off. Glenn calmly raised his hands, and Tony simply turned and ran. Michael, however, didn't care anymore. He just laughed at Tony's cowardice, which caused Jason and some of the others to laugh. Glenn, it's okay. We weren't together. But, he pointed aggressively and threateningly at the short man, a real friend would have told me that. And you're not a real friend, are you? Glenn tried to say something, but what was the use? He was entertaining Hope, along with Tony, and nothing could fix that. What Glenn could say at this point, what did it matter? I'm sorry, Michel. You're right. Glenn looked at all the other guys, friends who were now worried about him with their partners, and realized that they were all no longer friends. I'm sorry, I really am. Then, head down and shoulders slumped, he walked in the direction Tony had run off in. They finished the game in near silence. "I have a hot date with Heidi again tonight," Jason said enthusiastically after the game. "I'm going to do this. I'm going to ask her about being a little more serious. I think there's something to it." Michelle hugged him as tightly as he could, repaying him for the kindness his friend had shown him so long ago and so many times. "You're going to make it, Jace. I wish you the best of luck." Michelle parted from the hot nurse Meredith, who was more than a little upset. He tried to be gentle and did it in person at her house. She thought the handsome teacher would make an honest woman out of her, but it didn't happen. She was heartbroken that the relationship she had longed for so much had suddenly turned to ashes. When the conversation didn't go well, Michelle felt terrible and tried to reassure her. But his words meant nothing. His actions were meaningless. They both cried, but her tears were the tears of a wounded man, and his were the tears of a guilty man. And then, still reeling from what had happened, he visited his parents. "I'm so sorry, Michelle." His mother was heartbroken by the complete collapse of his relationship with Hope and upset that she had intervened when he had begged them not to. But mothers often think they know best, and Jean had certainly thought so at the time. She remembered how happy he had been with Hope, and she desperately wanted her child to be that happy again. She knew he loved her, and she wanted that love to stay with him, to instill in him the joy she longed for him. His father, however, was thrilled, especially when Michelle spoke of the relationship he now shared with Trisha. "I was trying to keep the peace. If you got Hope back, if you married her, I didn't want there to be animosity between us. We had to play both sides and pray that everything would end well. Not to mention your mother can be pretty stubborn at times. I'm glad you didn't listen to me. I'm glad you showed strength and listened to your heart and head. You're a smart man, Michelle, smarter than I am." It wasn't an instant reprieve, but family is family, and there is only one family, as his grandfather had said before his passing. He had bridges to mend before they were gone forever. So he tried to give them forgiveness, even though it hurt. It was only with Trisha's help that he was able to accomplish this. Now his parents saw that their son was happy again, and with Trisha by his side. Next chapter. Hope stared at the card in her hands. It had been 8 long, bitter months since that last awful meeting at the Brown Street Cafe. She had tried to rebuild friendships, but it had been slow and painful, in tears and self-loathing. That beautiful postcard with the slight scent of lavender set her back. It opened old wounds that she had hoped were already healed or close to healing. Now she knew it would take much longer, require more effort, and cost much more pain and suffering. Michelle Corbin and Trisha Stevens lovingly wish for you to be present with them to celebrate their upcoming marriage, built on love, honesty, friendship, and trust. She didn't read any further. She couldn't read any further. The invitation was sent to the trash can and tears came to her eyes. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.